In a quiet Ohio suburb, I was about to discover the most horrifying betrayal imaginable. What started as a peaceful Tuesday morning coffee in my kitchen took a devastating turn when I stumbled upon my own son discussing my funeral arrangements while I was very much alive and healthy. I'm Kath Morrison, and at 68 years old, I thought I knew my family. I was wrong. What I overheard that morning would shatter everything I believed about the people I loved most, and set in motion a chain of events that would transform not just my life, but my entire understanding of who I could trust. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun streamed through my kitchen window, casting warm patterns across the yellow linoleum floors that Frank and I had installed together 23 years ago. I was stirring my second cup of coffee, the one I always made extra strong because Frank used to tease me that my first cup was just flavored water. Even 2 years after his passing, I still made coffee for 2 out of habit, though the second cup usually went cold on the counter by noon. My name is Kath Morrison, and for 37 years, I served as the head librarian at Millbrook Public Library. People in our small Ohio town knew me as the woman who could find any book, answer any research question, and organize the annual summer reading program that brought hundreds of children through our doors each July. I was the librarian who stayed late to help high school students with their research papers, who ordered special books for elderly patrons with failing eyesight, and who never once charged a late fee to a family going through hard times. Frank and I had built a good life in our modest ranch home on Maple Street. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, and a finished basement where Frank had his workshop, and I kept my extensive collection of first edition mysteries. We'd raised our son Brian in this house, watched him graduate from high school, college, and eventually start his own family. When Frank died suddenly of a heart attack at age 70, I thought my world had ended. But I learned to carry on, to find purpose in my daily routines, my garden, and my weekly visits with Brian and his family. That Tuesday morning in October, I was planning my day around simple pleasures. Helen next door had promised to bring over some of her famous apple butter. George was coming to winterize my sprinkler system, and I had 3 new mystery novels from the library's donation pile waiting for me on the coffee table. At 68, I was healthy, active, and fully capable of managing my own life. My doctor had given me a clean bill of health just the month before, commenting on how well I was aging and how sharp my mind remained. I was reaching for my reading glasses when the phone rang. Our old landline had excellent reception throughout the house, and I'd grown accustomed to the way conversations sometimes carried from room to room when multiple extensions were being used. What I didn't realize was that Brian was already on the line when I picked up the kitchen extension, and he was in the middle of a conversation that would change everything. Brian's voice was tense in a way I hadn't heard since his father died. He was talking to someone, and from the formal tone of the conversation, I knew it wasn't family. I should have hung up immediately, should have given him privacy, but something in his voice made me pause, with the receiver halfway to its cradle. "Yes, we need to expedite the arrangements," Brian was saying. "My mother doesn't have much time left, and we want everything in place before she becomes too confused to understand what's happening." My hand froze on the phone. Time left? Confused? I felt perfectly fine. Better than fine, actually. I'd been swimming at the community center 3 times a week, tending my garden, and just last week I'd helped organize the library's book sale with the efficiency that had made me legendary among my former colleagues. "The funeral home can accommodate us on short notice," came another voice, professional and sympathetic. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. We understand how difficult these situations can be for families. Has she expressed any preferences for the service? Funeral home. I gripped the kitchen counter, my coffee cup forgotten. They were talking about my funeral as if I were already dead, or as if my death were imminent and certain. "She's always been traditional," Brian continued, his voice taking on the measured tone he used when discussing business matters. "Simple service, nothing elaborate. The important thing is that we handle all the arrangements now, while we can still make decisions without her interference. Once she's gone, we want everything to proceed smoothly." "Of course," the funeral director replied. And you mentioned there might be some family dynamics to consider regarding the estate. My mother has been very secretive about her financial arrangements, Brian said, and I detected a frustration in his voice that chilled me. She's always handled everything herself, never involved me in her planning. But with her condition deteriorating so rapidly, we need to make sure everything is properly arranged. The house alone is worth quite a bit, and there are investments my father left that she's never discussed with us. Condition deteriorating? I stared at my reflection in the kitchen window, seeing a woman who looked tired but healthy, perhaps a bit lonely, but certainly not someone on death's door. What condition was Brian talking about? I'd been to the doctor recently. I was fine. We've scheduled the initial consultation for Thursday, the funeral director continued. We'll have the basic package ready for your review, and we can discuss payment arrangements. Will your mother be participating in these discussions? No, Brian said quickly. She's not really capable of making these kinds of decisions anymore. The stress would be too much for her, and honestly, she gets confused about financial matters. It's better if we handle everything ourselves. I wasn't confused about anything, least of all my finances. I'd been managing money since I was 18 years old, had put myself through library science school, had helped Frank build our retirement savings, and had been successfully managing my own affairs for 2 years since his death. The accusation of confusion stung, but it was the casual dismissal of my involvement in my own funeral planning that made my hands shake with anger. That's very thoughtful of you, the funeral director said. Many families find it easier to make arrangements without the emotional burden on the patient. We'll have everything ready for Thursday. Should we plan for immediate family only, or will there be a larger gathering? We'll keep it small, Brian replied. My mother was always a private person, and honestly, many of her friends are getting up there in age themselves. We don't want to burden anyone with a big production. Private person? I'd been one of the most social people in Millbrook for decades. The library had been the heart of community activity, and I'd been friends with half the town. The idea that Brian would limit my funeral to immediate family was insulting, but the bigger concern was why we were having this conversation at all. One more question, the funeral director said. You mentioned your mother's condition. Has hospice been involved, or is this more of a precautionary arrangement? There was a pause that seemed to last forever. When Brian spoke again, his voice was lower, more careful. It's precautionary, but the doctors have been clear about the timeline. She's refusing additional medical intervention, and we want to respect her wishes while making sure everything is in place when the time comes. Refusing medical intervention? I hadn't refused anything because nothing had been offered. I wasn't sick. This conversation was making no sense, and yet it was happening in my own house, about my own death, without my knowledge or consent. We understand completely, the funeral director said. It's never easy, but you're doing the right thing by planning ahead. We'll see you Thursday at 2 o'clock. The line went quiet, and I realized Brian had hung up. I stood in my kitchen, still holding the phone, feeling as though the ground had shifted beneath my feet. My son, the child I'd raised with love and sacrifice, the man I'd supported through college and his early career struggles, was planning my funeral while I stood, healthy and alive in my own home. But it wasn't just the funeral planning that disturbed me. It was the way he'd spoken about my mental state, my financial capabilities, my social connections. He'd painted a picture of a woman who was incompetent, isolated, and dying, none of which was true. The question that haunted me as I finally hung up the phone was why. Why would Brian lie to a funeral director about my condition? Why would he arrange my funeral without consulting me? And why would he specifically mention keeping me out of financial discussions? I sank into Frank's old chair at the kitchen table, the one with the worn cushion where he used to read the morning paper. For the first time since his death, I felt truly alone. Not lonely, which had become familiar, but alone in a way that suggested danger. If my own son was lying about my mental and physical condition to strangers, what else might he be planning? What other arrangements was he making without my knowledge? The rational part of my mind, the librarian who'd spent decades helping people research and verify information, knew I needed to understand what was happening before I reacted. But the mother in me, the woman who'd loved this child unconditionally for 42 years, felt a betrayal so deep it made my chest ache. I looked around my kitchen, the heart of the home Frank and I had built together. The ceramic canisters I'd collected over the years, the photo of Brian's high school graduation magneted to the refrigerator, the small herb garden growing on the windowsill that I tended every morning. This was the life of a competent, engaged woman, not someone on the verge of death or mental incapacity. But if Brian was lying to funeral directors about my condition, who else had he spoken to? What other professionals might have been given false information about my health, my mental state, my needs? The implications were staggering and terrifying. I forced myself to think methodically the way I'd taught hundreds of library patrons to approach research problems. What did I know for certain? I was healthy. I was mentally sharp, I was financially stable. I had been managing my own affairs successfully since Frank's death. These were facts, not opinions or perceptions. What did I suspect? That Brian was lying about my condition for reasons I didn't yet understand. That he was making arrangements regarding my death and possibly my estate without my knowledge or consent. That he viewed me as incompetent or confused when I was neither. What did I need to find out? Everything. I needed to know what other conversations Brian had been having, what other arrangements he'd been making, and why he felt entitled to plan my life and death without consulting me. The phone rang again, jolting me out of my analysis. This time I answered immediately, hoping it might be Brian calling back, perhaps to explain what I'd overheard. Instead, it was Helen from next door. "Kath, honey, I hope you don't mind me calling, but Brian stopped by yesterday while you were at the grocery store. He seemed very concerned about you, said you'd been having some health issues you weren't telling anyone about. Is everything all right?" My stomach dropped. Brian had been spreading his lies to my neighbors, to my friends. "Helen, what exactly did Brian tell you?" "Well, he said you'd been having some memory problems, getting confused about things. He mentioned that you'd been forgetting appointments and having trouble managing your medication. He seemed really worried, Kath. He asked me to keep an eye on you and let him know if I noticed anything concerning." I closed my eyes, feeling the web of deception expanding around me. Brian wasn't just lying to funeral directors. He was systematically telling people in my community that I was experiencing cognitive decline. He was recruiting my own neighbors to spy on me and report back to him about my supposed deterioration. "Helen," I said carefully, "have you noticed any of these problems he mentioned?" There was a pause. "Well, no, not really. You seem like yourself to me. But Kath, if you're having health problems, you know I'm here to help. We all are. You don't have to handle everything alone." "I appreciate that, Helen. Can I ask you something? Has anyone else in the neighborhood mentioned being concerned about me?" "Actually, yes. George said Brian talked to him, too, asked him to watch for signs that you might be struggling with yard work or home maintenance. And I think he spoke to the Johnsons across the street. We've all been kind of watching out for you, honey." The scope of Brian's campaign was becoming clear. He'd gone through my neighborhood, systematically telling my friends and neighbors that I was experiencing cognitive decline and needed monitoring. He'd turned my community into unwitting surveillance, all based on lies about my mental state. "Helen, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen carefully. I am not having memory problems. I am not confused about anything. I am not taking any medications that I'm having trouble managing. I don't know why Brian told you these things, but they're not true." The silence on the other end of the line stretched uncomfortably. Finally, Helen spoke, her voice cautious. "Kath, honey, sometimes when people are having cognitive issues, they don't realize it themselves. Maybe Brian is seeing things that you're not aware of." The patronizing tone in her voice, the gentle skepticism, made me realize how effective Brian's lies had been. He'd created a narrative about my mental decline that was so convincing that even my closest friends were now questioning my own assessment of my capabilities. "Helen, I understand your concern, but I'm asking you to trust me. I know my own mind. I know when I'm confused and when I'm not. Whatever Brian told you about my health, he was mistaken." "Of course, dear. I just want you to know that we're all here for you, whatever you need." After hanging up, I realized that Brian's deception was more sophisticated and far-reaching than I'd initially understood. He wasn't just planning my funeral prematurely. He was creating a foundation of community concern about my mental state, that could potentially be used to justify taking control of my life and my decisions. But why? What was Brian's motivation for this elaborate deception? As I sat in Frank's chair, staring at the phone that had delivered such devastating news, I began to consider possibilities that made my heart race with anxiety and anger. If Brian succeeded in convincing people that I was mentally incompetent, he might be able to gain legal control over my finances. If he could present a pattern of community concern about my welfare, he might be able to have me declared unable to manage my own affairs. If he could demonstrate that I was isolated and declining, he might be able to force me into assisted living or worse. The house Frank and I had worked so hard to pay off was worth nearly $300,000 in today's market. My retirement savings, Frank's life insurance, and our modest investment portfolio represented financial security that could solve a lot of problems for a family struggling with modern economic pressures. If Brian was facing financial difficulties I didn't know about, my assets would represent a tempting solution. But even if money was the motivation, the betrayal cut deeper than mere greed. This was my son, the child I'd rocked through nightmares, taught to ride a bicycle, supported through college heartbreaks and career setbacks, the man who called me every Sunday, who brought his family for dinner every few weeks, who'd helped me navigate the legal complexities after Frank's death. How long had he been planning this? How long had he been lying to my neighbors, my friends, potentially my doctors? How long had he been viewing me not as his mother but as an obstacle to financial security? The betrayal was devastating, but as I sat in my quiet kitchen, I felt something else rising alongside the hurt. Anger. The same fierce protectiveness that had driven me to fight for library funding year after year. That had motivated me to advocate for better resources for the children and families who depended on our services. Brian might have underestimated his mother, but he was about to discover that 37 years of public service had taught me how to research, how to build alliances, and how to fight for what was right. I looked at the phone again, the instrument that had revealed Brian's betrayal, and made a decision. If my son wanted to play games with my life and my reputation, he was about to learn that his mother was far more formidable than he'd assumed. The woman who'd built one of the most respected library systems in Ohio wasn't going to be easily dismissed or deceived. But first, I needed to understand the full scope of what I was dealing with. I needed to know who else Brian had spoken to, what other lies he'd told, and what legal or medical steps he might have already taken. This wasn't just about stopping a premature funeral arrangement. This was about defending my independence, my dignity, and my right to control my own life. As I rose from Frank's chair and moved toward my desk where I kept important papers and phone numbers, I felt the librarian in me taking charge. This was a research project now, the most important one of my life. I needed information, allies, and a strategy. Brian might have thought he was dealing with a confused, isolated elderly woman, but he was actually dealing with a professional researcher who just discovered the most important mystery she'd ever been asked to solve. The game was on, and my son had no idea what he'd started. The first thing I did after Helen's call was walk straight to my filing cabinet. 37 years as a librarian had taught me that information was power, and if Brian was building a case against my competency, I needed to understand exactly what foundation he was working from. My hands were steady as I pulled out my medical records, financial statements, and legal documents. Everything was organized, up to date, and meticulously maintained. Hardly the paperwork of someone experiencing cognitive decline. My most recent physical from Dr. Williams showed blood pressure within normal range, cholesterol levels that were actually better than they'd been in years, and cognitive function tests that placed me well above average for my age group. I'd even joked with Dr. Williams about how sharp my memory remained, how I could still recall the Dewey Decimal System numbers for obscure subject classifications without looking them up. The medical evidence directly contradicted everything Brian had been telling people about my health. But as I spread the documents across my dining room table, I realized I needed to approach this investigation like any complex research project. I pulled out a yellow legal pad and began making lists, a habit that had served me well through countless library budget meetings and program planning sessions. At the top of the first page, I wrote Brian's claims and began documenting everything I could remember from his conversation with the funeral director and Helen's report of his neighborhood visits. According to Brian, I was experiencing memory problems, confusion about daily tasks, inability to manage medications, and general cognitive decline rapid enough to warrant immediate funeral planning. He'd also mentioned my supposed refusal of medical intervention and claimed that doctors had given him some kind of timeline for my deterioration. Every single claim was false, but I needed to understand why he was making them and who else might have heard them. I started a second list titled People Brian Has Contacted and began working through my neighborhood systematically. Helen next door had confirmed that Brian spoke to her and George about my supposed decline. He'd also talked to the Johnsons across the street. That was just from one conversation with Helen. How many other people had received similar warnings about my mental state? The implications were staggering. Brian wasn't just lying to a funeral director. He was conducting what amounted to a propaganda campaign designed to establish a narrative of my incompetence throughout my community. If he succeeded in convincing enough people that I was mentally declining, he could potentially use their testimony to support legal action against me. I picked up the phone and dialed George's number. George Henderson had been our neighbor for 15 years, a retired mechanic who'd helped Frank with various home projects, and had continued to assist me with heavier maintenance tasks since Frank's death. If anyone would give me a straight answer about what Brian had told him, it would be George. "George, it's Kath. I hope I'm not interrupting your afternoon." "Not at all, Kath. How are you feeling today?" The question, which should have been routine, now carried an undertone of assessment that I'd never noticed before. "I'm feeling fine, George. Actually, I'm calling because I need to ask you about something. Helen mentioned that Brian spoke with you recently about some concerns he has about my health." There was a pause. "Well, yes, he did. Kath, I hope you don't mind, but he was worried about you. Said you'd been having some memory issues, maybe getting a little confused about things. He asked me to keep an eye out, make sure you weren't struggling with anything you were too proud to ask for help with." "George, in the 2 years since Frank died, have you personally observed any signs that I was confused or having memory problems?" Another pause, longer this time. "Honestly, Kath, no. You've always seemed sharp as ever to me. But your son knows you better than I do. If he's concerned, there might be things he's noticing that aren't obvious to the rest of us." The same pattern I'd heard with Helen. Brian's lies were so convincing, so delivered with apparent concern and authority as my son, that people were accepting them despite their own contrary observations. My neighbors were literally choosing to believe Brian's false narrative over the evidence of their own interactions with me. "George, I appreciate your honesty. Can I ask what specific things Brian mentioned he was concerned about?" "He said you'd been asking the same questions multiple times, forgetting conversations you'd had, maybe having trouble keeping track of appointments. He mentioned that you'd been having some trouble managing your finances, getting confused about bills and such." My finances. There it was again. Brian had specifically mentioned financial confusion to the funeral director, and now George was repeating similar claims. This wasn't random character assassination. It was targeted at my financial competency specifically. "George, have you ever seen any evidence that I was having trouble managing my affairs? When you've been here working on the house, have you noticed unpaid bills, forgotten appointments, anything like that?" "No, Kath. If anything, you're more organized than most people half your age. But like I said, maybe these are things that show up more at home, in situations I wouldn't see." After hanging up with George, I felt the weight of Brian's strategy becoming clear. He'd created doubt about my competency, without requiring anyone to actually witness incompetent behavior. By positioning himself as the concerned son who was privy to private information about my decline, he'd made it reasonable for people to believe problems existed even when they couldn't see them personally. But why would Brian go to such elaborate lengths to convince people I was incompetent? The answer seemed increasingly obvious: control of my assets. At 68, I was hardly at death's door. But if Brian could convince a court that I was mentally declining, he could potentially gain guardianship over my financial affairs. If he could demonstrate a pattern of community concern about my welfare, he could argue that intervention was necessary for my own protection. I needed to know more about my legal vulnerability, so I called Carol Patterson, the attorney who'd helped Frank and me with our estate planning 5 years earlier. Carol had been practicing elder law for over 20 years and would understand the implications of what Brian was attempting. "Kath, how wonderful to hear from you. How have you been managing since Frank's passing?" "I've been doing well, Carol, but I need to discuss something confidential with you. Can you see me this week?" "Of course. Is everything all right?" I'm not sure. I need to understand my legal rights regarding guardianship proceedings, and what kind of evidence would be required for someone to challenge my competency. The concern in Carol's voice was immediate. Kath, is someone threatening to pursue guardianship against you? I'm not certain yet, but I need to understand my legal position. How difficult would it be for a family member to have me declared incompetent? It depends on the evidence they could present. Ohio law requires clear and convincing proof of incapacity, but that can include medical testimony, witness statements about declining function, and evidence of poor decision-making. Has someone been documenting concerns about your mental state? The question hit like a physical blow because I knew the answer was yes. Brian had been systematically creating a record of supposed concerns about my competency, gathering testimony from neighbors and friends, and possibly even consulting with medical professionals using false information about my condition. Carol, I need to see you as soon as possible. I believe someone may be building a case to challenge my competency based on false information. I can see you tomorrow at 10. Kath, until we talk, don't sign any documents, don't make any major financial decisions, and document everything you can remember about any conversations regarding your mental state. That evening, I sat in Frank's workshop in the basement, surrounded by his carefully organized tools and the woodworking projects he'd never finished. It was the most private space in the house, where I could think without feeling watched or monitored. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was hiding in my own home because I suspected my son was plotting against me. I pulled out my laptop, a skill I'd learned later in life but mastered well enough to help library patrons with digital research. If Brian was building a case against my competency, I needed to understand exactly what tactics were available to him and what evidence would be most convincing to a court. What I found in my research was both enlightening and terrifying. Adult guardianship proceedings in Ohio were designed to protect vulnerable elderly people from exploitation, but they could also be used by unscrupulous family members to gain control over assets. The most common path to guardianship involved demonstrating a pattern of declining mental function, typically supported by medical testimony and witness statements from family and community members. Brian appeared to be following this playbook precisely. He'd contacted my neighbors to establish a pattern of community concern. He'd mentioned medical professionals and timelines, suggesting he might have consulted with healthcare providers. He'd specifically focused on financial competency, which was often the key issue in guardianship proceedings. But as I read through case studies and legal precedents, I also found reasons for hope. Successful guardianship challenges required substantial evidence of actual incapacity. Mere concerns or worried family members weren't sufficient. The person being challenged had the right to legal representation, to present contrary evidence, and to demonstrate their own competency. More importantly, I learned that false or misleading testimony in guardianship proceedings could result in serious legal consequences for the person bringing the petition. If I could prove that Brian had been deliberately lying about my mental state, he could face charges of fraud, perjury, and elder abuse. I spent the next several hours documenting everything I could remember about Brian's behavior over the past few months. Had there been signs that he was planning this? Looking back with new awareness, I began to see patterns that had seemed innocent at the time but now appeared calculated. Brian had been asking increasingly personal questions about my finances during his Sunday phone calls. Questions about my investment accounts, whether I was still managing my own taxes, if I'd considered updating my will. At the time, I'd interpreted these as natural concern for my welfare, but now they seemed like reconnaissance. He'd also been visiting more frequently, often showing up unexpectedly, and then commenting on things like whether I'd remembered to take out the trash or if I'd paid certain bills. I'd thought he was being helpful, but now I wondered if he'd been looking for evidence of decline or even creating situations where I might appear confused or forgetful. Most disturbing was a conversation we'd had just last month about my long-term plans. Brian had suggested that I might want to consider selling the house and moving somewhere with more support services. When I'd firmly declined, he'd seemed frustrated in a way that hadn't made sense at the time. Now I wondered if he'd already been counting on the proceeds from my home to solve whatever financial problems he was facing. I needed allies, people who could testify to my competency and help me understand the full scope of Brian's deception. But I had to be careful about who I trusted. If Brian had been lying to my neighbors, He might have also contacted my former colleagues, my doctors, or other people in my life. The next morning, I called my former assistant librarian, Margaret Chen, who'd worked with me for over 15 years before I retired. Margaret was sharp, observant, and had maintained regular contact with me since my retirement. If anyone could provide reliable testimony about my mental state, it would be someone who'd worked closely with me in a professional capacity. Kath, how are you, dear? I was just thinking about you yesterday when I was processing some new mystery acquisitions. I'm well, Margaret, but I need to ask you something important. Has anyone contacted you recently asking about my health or mental state? Actually, yes. Your son Brian called me about 2 weeks ago. He seemed very concerned about you, said you'd been having some memory problems and difficulty managing daily tasks. He asked if I'd noticed any changes during our conversations or when you'd visited the library. My stomach sank. Brian had contacted my professional colleagues as well. Margaret, what did you tell him? I told him the truth, that you seem exactly like yourself to me, sharp, organized, engaged. I was actually surprised by his concerns, because you've never given me any reason to worry about your mental faculties. If anything, you're still one of the most cognitively sharp people I know. Margaret, this is very important. Did Brian ask you to document your observations or report back to him about anything? He did ask me to let him know if I noticed any concerning changes in your behavior. He said he was trying to get a complete picture of your functioning so he could arrange appropriate support services. Support services. Another euphemism for control. Brian was systematically contacting everyone in my life, creating a network of people who believed they were helping monitor my decline, while actually gathering intelligence for his case against my competency. Margaret, I need to tell you something confidential, but I need your help. Brian has been lying about my mental state. I'm not experiencing any cognitive decline, memory problems, or confusion. I believe he's building a false case to challenge my competency for financial reasons. The silence on the other end of the line was telling. Finally, Margaret spoke, her voice careful. Kath, that's a very serious accusation. Are you certain about this? I'm absolutely certain. I overheard Brian arranging my funeral while I'm perfectly healthy. He's been telling my neighbors that I'm confused and declining. He's created an elaborate fiction about my mental state, and I need people who know the real me to help document the truth. Kath, if what you're saying is true, this is elder abuse. Financial exploitation of elderly family members is a serious crime. I know. That's why I need allies who can testify to my actual mental state versus the lies Brian has been spreading. Margaret, you've known me professionally for 15 years. You've seen me handle complex research projects, manage budgets, supervise staff, and interact with the public. Would you be willing to provide a statement about my cognitive abilities if needed? Absolutely. Kath, you're one of the most mentally sharp people I've ever worked with. If Brian is lying about your competency, that's not just wrong, it's criminal. Over the next few days, I systematically contacted other people in my life to understand the scope of Brian's deception and to begin building my own network of allies. What I discovered was both worse and better than I'd feared. Worse because Brian had been thorough. He'd contacted my hairdresser, my pharmacist, my bank branch manager, and even the pastor at my church. Each conversation followed the same pattern: expressions of concern about my supposed mental decline, requests for monitoring and reporting, and specific focus on my ability to manage financial affairs. Better because most of these people had the same reaction Margaret had: surprise at Brian's claims because they contradicted their own observations of my competency. My hairdresser Linda actually laughed when I asked if she'd noticed any decline in my mental abilities. Kath, you're still correcting my grammar when I tell you stories about my kids. Last week you helped me figure out a complicated scheduling problem that had me completely stumped. If you're experiencing mental decline, I'd hate to see what you were like at your peak. But the most revealing conversation was with Kath Morrison at First National Bank, where Frank and I had done our banking for over 20 years. Janet had known us both personally and professionally, and her reaction to Brian's claims was immediate skepticism. Mrs. Morrison, I have to tell you, I was surprised when your son called with those concerns. You've been managing your accounts flawlessly since Mr. Morrison passed, In fact, you caught an error in our quarterly statement that our own auditors had missed. You're one of our most financially savvy customers. Janet, what exactly did Brian tell you he was concerned about? He said you'd been having trouble understanding your financial statements, possibly making poor decisions about investments, and that he was worried about your vulnerability to financial scams. He asked if we could flag your account to require family notification for any large transactions. Family notification for large transactions. Brian had tried to insert himself into my banking relationship, creating a system where he'd be alerted to any significant financial decisions I made. If the bank had agreed, he would have gained effective oversight of my financial independence. Did you agree to flag my account? Absolutely not. Bank policy requires written authorization from the account holder for any such arrangement, and frankly, your son's concerns didn't match our experience with you at all. I told him that if you wanted family oversight of your accounts, you'd need to request it yourself. I felt a wave of gratitude for Janet's professionalism and adherence to banking regulations. Brian's attempt to gain financial oversight had failed, but only because of institutional safeguards and Janet's refusal to act on secondhand concerns about my competency. By the end of the week, I had a clear picture of Brian's strategy and a growing network of allies who could testify to my actual mental state. But I also understood that I was dealing with a more sophisticated and potentially dangerous situation than I'd initially realized. Brian wasn't just planning my funeral prematurely or spreading casual lies about my health. He was conducting a systematic campaign designed to establish legal grounds for challenging my competency. He'd contacted medical professionals, financial institutions, community members, and former colleagues in an apparent attempt to build a comprehensive case that I was mentally declining and in need of supervision. The question that haunted me was why. What had motivated my son to betray me so thoroughly? What financial pressures or personal problems had driven him to view his healthy, competent mother as an obstacle to be overcome, rather than a person to be loved and respected? But as I sat in my living room that Friday evening, surrounded by the documentation I'd gathered about Brian's deception and the statements of support I'd collected from people who knew the real me, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Frank's death. Purpose. For 37 years, I'd fought for library funding, better services for patrons, and fair treatment for my staff. Now I was fighting for something even more fundamental: my right to live independently and control my own life. Brian might have thought he was dealing with a vulnerable, isolated elderly woman, but he was actually dealing with a professional researcher who'd just uncovered the most important case of her career. And unlike the academic research projects I'd supervised over the years, this one had the highest possible stakes: my freedom, my dignity, and my future. The investigation was complete. Now it was time to plan my counterattack. Monday morning found me sitting across from Carol Patterson in her law office, a stack of documents between us that represented the most important legal consultation of my life. Carol had been practicing elder law since before it was even called that, and her office walls were covered with certificates and awards recognizing her advocacy for senior citizens' rights. If anyone could help me navigate this nightmare, it would be her. Kath, based on what you've told me and the documentation you've provided, your son appears to be laying the groundwork for a guardianship petition, Carol said, her voice grave as she reviewed my notes. The pattern of contacting multiple people in your life, the focus on financial competency, the attempts to insert himself into your banking relationships, these are classic tactics used to build a case for incapacity. I leaned forward in my chair, feeling the weight of confirmation that my worst fears were justified. Carol, how strong would his case be? Could he actually succeed in having me declared incompetent based on lies? Unfortunately, yes, if the lies are convincing enough and presented properly. Guardianship proceedings rely heavily on testimony from family members and community observers. If Brian can present a pattern of witnesses who express concern about your mental state, even if those concerns are based on his false representations, a judge might find that concerning enough to warrant further investigation or temporary restrictions on your autonomy. The thought of temporary restrictions sent a chill through me. What kind of restrictions? The court could freeze your assets pending a full competency evaluation. They could require supervised living arrangements. They could even grant Brian temporary guardianship while the case is being decided, which could take months. During that time, you would lose control over your own financial decisions, living arrangements, and medical care. I felt sick. Even if I ultimately proved my competency, Brian could effectively gain control over my life for the duration of the legal proceedings. The process itself could become the punishment, stripping away my independence while I fought to prove I deserved to keep it. However, Carol continued, Brian's approach also contains the seeds of his own destruction. By systematically lying to so many people about your condition, he's created a paper trail of fraud that could result in serious criminal charges. Elder abuse, including financial exploitation and emotional manipulation, carries significant penalties in Ohio. What do we need to do to protect me and to hold Brian accountable? Carol pulled out a fresh legal pad and began writing. First, we're going to document your competency so thoroughly that no court could question it. Medical evaluations, cognitive assessments, financial competency tests, and professional references. We're going to create an unassailable record of your mental acuity. Second, we're going to gather sworn statements from everyone Brian contacted, documenting exactly what he told them and how it contradicted their own observations of your capabilities. This will establish a pattern of deliberate deception that goes far beyond simple family concern. Third, we're going to investigate Brian's motivations. If he's facing financial problems that would be solved by gaining control of your assets, that strengthens the case that this is financially motivated elder abuse, rather than genuine concern for your welfare. I felt a surge of hope mixed with determination. Carol, I want to do more than just defend myself. I want to make sure Brian faces consequences for what he's attempted. And I want to send a message that elderly people won't be victimized by their own families without fighting back. I understand that impulse, Kath, and it's justified. What Brian has done is not just wrong, it's criminal. But we need to be strategic about how we proceed. If we move too aggressively, too quickly, he might accelerate his timeline and file for emergency guardianship before we're fully prepared. That afternoon, I underwent the most comprehensive cognitive evaluation of my life. Dr. Sarah Williams, a neuropsychologist who specialized in competency assessments, put me through hours of testing that examined every aspect of mental function. Memory tests, problem-solving exercises, financial comprehension assessments, and even personality evaluations designed to detect signs of manipulation or coercion. Mrs. Morrison, I want to be clear about something, Dr. Williams said as we concluded the testing session. Your performance on these assessments places you in the superior range for cognitive function, not just normal for your age, superior for any age. You demonstrate excellent memory, sharp analytical thinking, sound judgment, and complete understanding of complex financial and legal concepts. I felt a wave of validation that was almost overwhelming. Dr. Williams, if someone were to claim in court that I was experiencing cognitive decline or confusion, would your evaluation support that claim? Absolutely not. In fact, if someone made such claims in the face of this evaluation, I would question their motives and their honesty. Your cognitive function is not just intact, it's exceptional. But even as I celebrated this victory, I knew that medical documentation was only part of the battle. I needed to understand Brian's financial situation and motivations, and that required investigation skills I'd developed over decades of helping library patrons research complex topics. That evening, I sat at my computer and began digging into public records, property tax information, court filings, business licenses, bankruptcy records, all the digital trails that modern life leaves behind. What I found painted a picture that explained everything about Brian's behavior. Brian and Stephanie were in serious financial trouble. Their mortgage was underwater, with the house worth significantly less than what they owed. Brian's landscaping business, which I thought was thriving, had been struggling for over 2 years. He'd taken out multiple business loans and had defaulted on several of them. Court records showed judgments against the business, totaling over $80,000. Most damning was a recent filing for bankruptcy protection that had been dismissed because Brian couldn't meet the court's requirements for debt reorganization. He was facing the possibility of losing both his business and his home, and traditional bankruptcy relief had been denied. Suddenly, my assets looked like the perfect solution to Brian's problems. My house was worth $300,000, free and clear. My retirement accounts and Frank's life insurance had left me with nearly $500,000 in liquid assets. If Brian could gain control of my finances through guardianship, he could potentially solve all his financial problems at once. But there was something else I discovered that chilled me to the bone. Brian had consulted with an attorney who specialized in what the legal profession euphemistically called estate acceleration, helping families gain early access to inheritance assets when elderly relatives were deemed incapacitated. The consultation had taken place 6 months ago, long before any of his supposed concerns about my mental state had surfaced. This wasn't a son worried about his mother's declining health. This was a desperate man who had been planning to exploit his mother's assets for months, carefully laying the groundwork for a legal theft disguised as family concern. Armed with this information, I called Carol with an update on my findings. Her reaction was immediate and angry. "Kath, what you've uncovered transforms this from a potential guardianship dispute into a clear case of premeditated elder abuse. Brian has been planning this exploitation for months, possibly longer. We're not just going to defend against his actions. We're going to prosecute them. What's our next step? We're going to set a trap. We're going to let Brian proceed with his plans just far enough to commit actionable crimes, while ensuring you're protected throughout the process. When he files for guardianship or makes his move to control your assets, we'll be ready with evidence that destroys his credibility and exposes his true motives." The idea of actively encouraging Brian's betrayal was emotionally difficult, but intellectually I understood its necessity. If we moved against him too early, he could claim his actions were motivated by genuine concern rather than financial desperation. But if we allowed him to proceed with full knowledge of his deception, the criminal nature of his behavior would be undeniable. Over the next few days, I began implementing what Carol and I called our quote, documentation strategy. Every interaction with Brian was recorded when legally possible. Every conversation with people he'd contacted was documented with sworn statements. Every piece of evidence regarding his financial situation and advanced planning was preserved and cataloged. But the most challenging part of our strategy was maintaining normal interactions with Brian while knowing what he was planning. When he called for our usual Sunday phone conversation, I had to respond naturally while being acutely aware that he was probably listening for signs of confusion or decline that he could later report to others. "Hi, Mom, how was your week?" "It was good, honey. I had coffee with Helen, got my hair done, did some reading." The usual routine. I kept my voice steady and normal, even though every word felt loaded with subtext. "Are you keeping up with everything okay? Managing all your appointments and responsibilities?" There it was, the fishing expedition for evidence of decline. "Yes, I'm managing fine. Why do you ask?" "Just checking. You know I worry about you sometimes. Living alone in that big house, handling all the finances and maintenance by yourself, it's a lot for anyone, especially what, Brian?" "Well, you're not getting any younger, Mom. And since Dad died, you've seemed a little more forgetful sometimes. I just want to make sure you're not taking on more than you can handle." The gaslighting was subtle but unmistakable. Brian was trying to plant seeds of self-doubt about my own capabilities while positioning himself as the concerned son who noticed problems I couldn't see myself. "Brian, I appreciate your concern, but I'm managing everything just fine. If I need help with anything, I'll ask for it." "Of course, Mom. I just want you to know that Stephanie and I are here for you. If you ever need help with finances or decision-making or anything like that, we're happy to step in." Step in? The euphemism for taking control. "Thank you, dear. I'll keep that in mind." After hanging up, I felt the emotional toll of maintaining this charade. This was my son, the child I'd raised and loved, and he was actively trying to manipulate me into questioning my own competency. The betrayal was deeper than mere financial exploitation. It was psychological abuse designed to make me complicit in my own victimization. But I also felt a growing sense of power. Knowledge was protection, and I now understood exactly what Brian was attempting and why. More importantly, I had allies and legal representation that he knew nothing about. While he thought he was manipulating a vulnerable, isolated elderly woman, I was actually building a case that would expose him as a predator who targeted his own mother. The following Thursday, I received a call that changed everything. It was from Riverside Funeral Home, the same funeral director Brian had been discussing my arrangements with. "Mrs. Morrison, this is David Chen from Riverside Funeral Home. Your son Brian scheduled an appointment for this afternoon to finalize some arrangements, and I wanted to confirm that you'll be joining us for the consultation." My blood ran cold. Brian had moved up his timeline. He was proceeding with actual funeral arrangements, possibly planning to present me with fait accompli decisions about my own death. "Mr. Chen, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm not aware of any appointment, and I haven't requested any funeral arrangements." There was a pause. "Mrs. Morrison, your son indicated that you discussed these arrangements, and that you wanted to handle the planning while you were still able to participate in the decisions." Brian had lied to the funeral director about my involvement and consent. He was forging ahead with funeral planning without my knowledge, probably intending to present it as evidence of my own recognition of my declining condition. "Mr. Chen, I need to be very clear about something. I have not requested funeral arrangements. I have not discussed any such arrangements with my son. I am in good health and have no expectation of needing funeral services in the foreseeable future." Another pause, longer this time. "Mrs. Morrison, I'm confused. Your son has been very clear that these arrangements were at your request, and that time was of the essence due to your condition. What condition did my son tell you I have?" "He indicated that you're experiencing rapid cognitive decline and that your doctors have given you a limited timeline. He said you wanted to handle arrangements while you were still mentally capable of participating in the decisions." The depth of Brian's lies was staggering. He'd not only told the funeral director that I was dying, but that I was aware of my condition and had requested the arrangements myself. It was a perfect trap. If I showed up at the appointment, my presence could be interpreted as confirmation of the narrative Brian had created. If I didn't show up, my absence could be explained as evidence of my declining capacity to handle difficult decisions. "Mr. Chen, I need you to understand that everything my son has told you about my health and my wishes is false. I am not dying. I am not experiencing cognitive decline. I have not requested funeral arrangements. My son has been lying to you and to many other people about my condition. Mrs. Morrison, these are very serious allegations. Are you saying that your son has been deliberately misleading us about your medical situation?" "That's exactly what I'm saying. And I need to ask you to document this conversation and cancel any appointments or arrangements that have been made without my knowledge or consent." "Of course." "Mrs. Morrison, I have to tell you, if what you're saying is true, this puts us in a very difficult position. We've been operating under the assumption that we were helping a family plan for a difficult situation. If we've been given false information, Mr. Chen, you've been the victim of fraud just like I have. My son has been systematically lying about my health to multiple people in an apparent attempt to gain control over my affairs. I would appreciate it if you would document everything he's told you and be prepared to provide that information to my attorney if needed." After hanging up with the funeral director, I immediately called Carol with an update. Her reaction was swift and decisive. "Kath, Brian has just committed several felonies: fraud, elder abuse, and possibly identity theft, if he's been making arrangements in your name without authorization. We can't wait any longer. We need to move against him immediately. What do we do? First, we're filing a police report. What Brian has done constitutes criminal elder abuse under Ohio law, and law enforcement needs to be involved. Second, we're going to the courthouse tomorrow morning to file for a protective order that prevents Brian from making any decisions regarding your person or property. Third, we're going to contact every person and institution Brian has lied to and provide them with documentation of his fraud." That evening, I sat in Frank's workshop one last time, surrounded by his tools and unfinished projects. In less than 2 weeks, I'd gone from being a grieving widow living quietly in retirement to being the target of an elaborate fraud scheme perpetrated by my own son. But I'd also rediscovered strengths I'd thought were lost with Frank's death and my retirement from the library. Tomorrow would bring confrontation, legal proceedings, and probably the permanent destruction of my relationship with Brian. But it would also bring justice, protection, and the preservation of my independence and dignity. As I climbed the stairs to bed, I thought about the funeral arrangements Brian had been making without my knowledge. He'd been so focused on planning my death that he'd forgotten something important about who I was in life. I wasn't just a vulnerable elderly woman to be exploited. I was a professional researcher who'd spent 37 years fighting for what was right. Brian had picked the wrong mother to mess with. Friday morning arrived with an unseasonable chill that seemed to match the gravity of what lay ahead. I stood at my kitchen window, watching Detective Maria Santos pull into my driveway, followed by Carol's familiar sedan. Today would be the day that Brian's carefully constructed web of lies would finally collapse, but I knew it would also be the day that whatever remained of our mother-son relationship would die, along with his deceptions. Detective Santos was younger than I'd expected, probably in her 40s, with intelligent dark eyes and the kind of direct manner that suggested she'd dealt with elder abuse cases before. She shook my hand firmly when Carol introduced us, and I was grateful for the lack of condescension I'd grown accustomed to from some younger people when they interacted with seniors. "Mrs. Morrison, I've reviewed the documentation your attorney provided, and I want you to know that we take elder abuse cases very seriously. What your son has allegedly done represents multiple criminal violations, and we're going to investigate this thoroughly." Detective Santos settled into my living room with a recording device and a thick folder of papers. "I need to walk through everything systematically, starting with the first incident you became aware of." For the next 2 hours, I recounted every detail of Brian's deception, from the overheard funeral planning conversation to his systematic campaign of lies throughout my community. Detective Santos took meticulous notes, asking clarifying questions that demonstrated her understanding of both the legal and emotional complexities of the situation. "Mrs. Morrison, based on what you've told me and the evidence your attorney has provided, we have grounds to pursue charges of elder abuse, fraud, identity theft, and potentially conspiracy if your daughter-in-law was knowingly involved in the scheme." Detective Santos closed her notebook and leaned forward. "However, I want you to understand what's going to happen next. We're going to arrest your son and bring him in for questioning. This will become public record. Your family situation will be exposed in ways that might be uncomfortable for you." I had been dreading this moment, but I also knew it was necessary. "Detective Santos, my son made his choices when he decided to treat me as a financial opportunity rather than as his mother. I won't let my discomfort enable him to victimize other elderly people in the future. That's exactly the right attitude. Mrs. Morrison, you should also know that cases like this often inspire other victims to come forward. Elder abuse is significantly underreported because victims are often ashamed or afraid of damaging family relationships. Your willingness to prosecute might help other seniors find the courage to protect themselves." After Detective Santos left to coordinate Brian's arrest, Carol and I spent the morning calling everyone Brian had contacted with his lies. Each conversation was both vindicating and heartbreaking, as friends and neighbors expressed shock at learning they'd been manipulated into participating in a scheme against me. Helen next door was the most upset. "Kath, I feel terrible. I actually questioned your competency because your own son was so convincing about your decline. I should have trusted my own observations instead of believing second-hand concerns." "Helen, you were trying to be helpful. Brian exploited your kindness and concern, which makes him the villain in this situation, not you." George was angry in a way I'd rarely heard from him. "Kath, that boy used me as a spy against you. He made me feel like I was helping when I was actually participating in some kind of con game. I'm so sorry." Margaret from the library was already thinking like the professional researcher she'd always been. "Kath, I'm going to document every interaction I had with Brian, including dates, times, and exact quotes of what he told me. If this goes to trial, you'll need precise testimony about his pattern of deception." By noon, we had sworn statements from 8 people Brian had contacted, each one documenting the lies he'd told and the ways those lies contradicted their own observations of my competency. The pattern was so consistent and so clearly calculated that it painted an undeniable picture of deliberate fraud. At 2:30, my phone rang. It was Brian, calling from the police station. "Mom, I need you to listen to me carefully. There's been a terrible misunderstanding. The police think I've been trying to hurt you somehow, and I need you to come down here and explain that everything I've done has been out of concern for your welfare." His voice was strained but still carried that manipulative tone I'd become so familiar with over the past weeks. Even facing arrest, he was still trying to use our relationship to escape the consequences of his actions. "Brian, there's no misunderstanding. I know exactly what you've been doing and why you've been doing it. I know about your financial problems, your bankruptcy filing, your consultation with the estate acceleration attorney 6 months ago. I know this was never about concern for my welfare." The silence on the other end of the line was telling. When Brian spoke again, his voice had changed completely. Gone was the manipulative concern, replaced by something colder and more desperate. "Mom, you don't understand the pressure I'm under. The business is failing, we're losing the house, the kids' college funds are gone. I thought if I could just get some help from your assets, I could turn everything around and pay it all back." "Help from my assets? Brian, you weren't asking for help. You were trying to steal from me by having me declared incompetent. You were planning my funeral while I'm perfectly healthy. You turned my friends and neighbors into unwitting accomplices in your scheme. I never meant for it to go this far. It started as just exploring options, but then everything spiraled out of control. Mom, please. I'm your son. Can't we work this out as a family?" The appeal to our relationship was Brian's last manipulation, and it was the cruelest one yet. After months of systematic betrayal, he wanted to use my love for him as a shield against the consequences of his actions. "Brian, you stopped being my son the moment you decided to treat me as a mark instead of as your mother. A son doesn't lie to funeral directors about his healthy mother's death. A son doesn't recruit his mother's neighbors to spy on her. A son doesn't try to steal his mother's independence and dignity to solve his own problems. Mom, please. Stephanie doesn't know anything about this. The kids don't know. If this goes public, it'll destroy our whole family. You destroyed our family when you chose fraud over honesty, theft over asking for help, manipulation over respect. I won't be your accomplice in covering up what you've done." After hanging up, I felt emotionally drained but also strangely liberated. For months, I'd been living under the shadow of Brian's deception, questioning my own perceptions and capabilities because someone I trusted had been systematically undermining my confidence. Now, with the truth exposed and legal protection in place, I could finally breathe freely in my own home again. That afternoon brought unexpected visitors. Alex, my 17-year-old grandson, arrived at my door with red eyes and a confused, angry expression that reminded me painfully of Brian at that age. "Grandma, I need to understand what's happening. Dad was arrested at work today, and Mom is saying it's all some kind of misunderstanding, but the police told her, you're the one who filed charges against him." I invited Alex inside, my heart breaking for this young man who was just learning that his father wasn't the person he'd believed him to be. How do you explain to a teenager that their parent is a criminal without destroying their faith and family entirely? "Alex, your father has been lying to people about my health and mental state in an attempt to gain control over my finances. He's been planning to have me declared incompetent so he could manage my assets to solve his business problems." Alex stared at me with confusion and growing horror. "That can't be right, Grandma. Dad loves you. He's always talking about how worried he is about you, how he wishes you'd let him help more." "Sweetie, your father's expressions of concern weren't genuine. They were part of a plan to make people believe I was incompetent. He contacted my neighbors, my former colleagues, even my bank, to spread lies about my mental state. But why would he do that? If he needed money, why didn't he just ask you for help?" It was such an innocent question, and it cut to the heart of why Brian's betrayal was so devastating. "I think your father was afraid I'd say no, or that I'd want to understand his financial situation before agreeing to help. It was easier for him to try to take what he wanted than to have an honest conversation about what he needed." Alex was quiet for a long time, processing information that was clearly reshaping his understanding of his father and his family. Finally, he spoke again, his voice small and hurt. "Grandma, Mom says Dad was just trying to protect you, that maybe you are having problems you don't realize. She says sometimes older people don't understand when they need help. The fact that Stephanie was still perpetuating Brian's lies, even after his arrest, showed me that she was either completely deceived or actively complicit in the scheme. Either way, she was now trying to manipulate Alex into doubting my competency, just as Brian had manipulated my neighbors. Alex, I understand this is confusing and painful for you, but I need you to think about our interactions over the past year. Have I seemed confused to you? Have I appeared to be struggling with daily tasks or having memory problems? Alex considered the question seriously. No, Grandma. You've always seemed like yourself to me. You help me with my homework, you remember all my friends' names, you keep track of my school events better than Mom does sometimes. Then trust your own observations over what other people are telling you. That's one of the most important skills you can develop as you become an adult. The ability to trust your own perceptions, even when others try to convince you they're wrong. We talked for another hour, with Alex asking difficult questions about the legal process, what would happen to his father, and how this would affect their family. I tried to be honest without being cruel, explaining that his father would have to face consequences for his actions, but that those consequences were the result of Brian's choices, not my decision to report them. When Alex was preparing to leave, he turned back to me with an expression that was both mature and heartbreaking. Grandma, I'm sorry Dad did this to you. And I'm sorry I didn't see it happening. I should have realized something was wrong when he kept asking me about whether you seemed confused or forgetful. The revelation that Brian had been trying to recruit his own teenage son as a witness against me was another layer of betrayal I hadn't expected. Alex, your father asked you to monitor my behavior? Yeah, over the past few months he kept asking if I'd noticed any changes in you, whether you seemed to be struggling with anything. He said it was because he loved you and wanted to make sure you were getting help if you needed it. I told him you seemed fine to me, but he said sometimes family members are the last to recognize problems. Brian had attempted to turn every relationship I valued into a surveillance network designed to gather evidence against my competency. My neighbors, my friends, my former colleagues, and even my own grandson had been recruited as unwitting participants in his scheme. That evening, Stephanie called. Her voice was cold and accusatory in a way that immediately put me on guard. Kath, I need you to understand what you've done to our family. Brian is sitting in jail because of your accusations, and our children are devastated. How could you do this to your own son? The victim blaming was immediate and absolute. In Stephanie's narrative, I was the villain for exposing Brian's crimes, rather than Brian being the villain for committing them. Stephanie, Brian is in jail because he committed multiple felonies against me. I didn't put him there, his own actions did. Brian was trying to help you. Maybe his methods weren't perfect, but everything he did came from a place of love and concern. You've turned a family disagreement into a criminal case. Family disagreement? Stephanie, Brian tried to have me declared incompetent based on lies. He was planning my funeral while I'm healthy. He recruited my friends and neighbors to spy on me. This wasn't a disagreement. It was a systematic fraud designed to steal my independence and my assets. Brian told me about your financial situation, Kath. You're sitting on hundreds of thousands of dollars while your son's business is failing and your grandchildren's college funds are gone. Don't you think family should help family? The entitlement in her voice was breathtaking. Stephanie believed that my assets belonged to them by right, and that my refusal to hand over my life savings constituted some kind of selfishness rather than reasonable financial independence. Stephanie, if Brian needed financial help, he could have asked for it honestly. Instead, he chose to lie, manipulate, and attempt to defraud me. Those choices have consequences. You're destroying our family over money, Kath. Is your bank account really more important than your relationship with your son and grandchildren? The manipulation was sophisticated but transparent. Stephanie was trying to make me responsible for the consequences of Brian's actions by framing my pursuit of justice as greed or family destruction. I'm protecting myself from financial abuse, Stephanie. If Brian's relationship with me couldn't survive his failure to defraud me, then that relationship was never real to begin with. After hanging up, I realized that Stephanie's call had actually been helpful in an unexpected way. Her defense of Brian's actions and her sense of entitlement to my assets suggested that she was more than just an unwitting victim of his lies. Her attitude indicated that she supported the scheme even after its criminal nature had been exposed. The next morning brought news from Detective Santos that Brian had been formally charged with elder abuse, fraud, and identity theft. He'd been released on bond but was prohibited from contacting me directly or attempting to access any of my financial accounts. Mrs. Morrison, your son's attorney is already talking about a plea bargain. These cases rarely go to trial because the evidence is usually overwhelming and the defendants don't want the publicity of a public trial. However, I want you to be prepared for the possibility that Brian's legal team might try to argue that his actions were motivated by genuine concern for your welfare. Detective, will my competency evaluations and the statements from people he lied to be sufficient to counter that defense? Absolutely. We have clear evidence that Brian knowingly made false statements about your mental state to multiple people over an extended period. That's not concerned family behavior. That's criminal fraud. His financial motivations only make the case stronger. Carol arrived shortly after Detective Santos left, carrying a thick folder of legal documents that would reshape my life in ways I was only beginning to understand. Kath, we need to discuss next steps. Beyond the criminal case, we need to think about civil remedies and long-term protection. I'm recommending that we pursue a restraining order that prevents Brian from making any representations about your health or competency to third parties. We should also consider a civil lawsuit for damages. What kind of damages? Emotional distress, damage to your reputation in the community, costs associated with proving your competency, and potentially punitive damages to send a message about the consequences of elder abuse. Brian's actions caused real harm that goes beyond the failed fraud. As we discussed the civil case, I found myself thinking about Alex and the other grandchildren who were innocent victims of their father's choices. Whatever legal remedies I pursued against Brian, I wanted to make sure they didn't unfairly impact the children who had nothing to do with his scheme. Carol, is there a way to structure any financial settlement to benefit my grandchildren directly rather than going through Brian and Stephanie? Absolutely. We can establish educational trusts or other vehicles that provide for the children, while ensuring that Brian can't access or control those funds. In fact, that kind of arrangement might actually strengthen our case by demonstrating that your concern is for the children's welfare, rather than simple retaliation against Brian. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done since Frank's death. I called my insurance agent and scheduled a comprehensive review of my life insurance policies. Not because I was planning to die anytime soon, but because I wanted to make sure that when I did eventually pass away, my assets would go to people who valued me as a person rather than as a financial opportunity. The conversation with my insurance agent was both practical and emotionally charged. Removing Brian as a beneficiary felt like officially acknowledging that he had chosen financial gain over family love, but it also felt like protecting my legacy from someone who had proven willing to exploit it. As I sat in my living room that evening, surrounded by the legal documents that would protect my independence and hold Brian accountable for his crimes, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Frank's death. Peace. Not the peace of resolution, because the legal process would take months to complete, but the peace of knowing that I was no longer living under the shadow of someone else's deception. My phone rang one final time that day. It was Alex, calling to tell me that he decided to stay with a friend for a while because the tension at home was too intense. Grandma, I want you to know that I understand why you had to do what you did. Dad made his choices, and now he has to deal with the consequences. I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself. As I hung up the phone, I realized that the most important victory wasn't legal or financial. It was the preservation of my relationship with my grandson, who had learned to value truth over family loyalty and justice over convenience. Whatever else came from this nightmare, Alex would grow up knowing that integrity matters more than relationships that require you to sacrifice your dignity to maintain them. Tomorrow would bring more legal proceedings, more difficult conversations, and more painful revelations about the son I thought I knew. But tonight, for the first time in months, I was sleeping in my own home without fear, surrounded by the security that comes from knowing exactly who you can trust and why. 6 months later, I stood in Judge Patricia Harrison's courtroom as Brian's plea hearing concluded. He had accepted a deal for 2 years of supervised probation, restitution for my legal costs, and a permanent restraining order that prohibited him from making any representations about my health or competency to anyone. The criminal case was over, but the transformation it had sparked in my life was just beginning. As Brian left the courthouse with his attorney, he looked back at me one final time. I saw no remorse in his eyes, only resentment that his scheme had been discovered and thwarted. In that moment, I felt the last vestige of my maternal grief for the son I thought I'd raised. The man walking away was a stranger who happened to share my DNA. Carol walked with me to my car, carrying the final legal documents that officially closed this chapter of my life. Kath, I have to tell you something. In 30 years of practicing elder law, I've never seen a victim fight back as effectively as you did. Most people in your situation either don't recognize the abuse or don't have the resources to combat it. You've set a precedent that will help other seniors protect themselves. The civil settlement had been more generous than I'd expected. Beyond restitution for my legal costs, Brian had agreed to pay damages that I immediately placed in educational trusts for Alex and his sister Emma. The children would have their college funds restored, but Brian would never have access to control those resources. More importantly, the case had attracted attention from the Ohio Attorney General's office, which had launched an investigation into elder abuse prevention. My story had been featured in senior advocacy publications, and I'd been invited to speak at conferences about recognizing and preventing financial exploitation of elderly family members. But the most meaningful change in my life had nothing to do with legal victories or public recognition. 3 months after Brian's arrest, I had received a call that would reshape my retirement in ways I'd never imagined. Mrs. Morrison, this is Jennifer Walsh, from the Ohio Department of Aging. We've been following your case, and we're wondering if you'd be interested in joining our Elder Justice Task Force. We need advocates who understand both the vulnerability of seniors and the legal tools available to protect them. I had accepted immediately, and within weeks I was traveling across Ohio, training social workers, law enforcement officers, and healthcare providers to recognize signs of elder abuse. My background as a librarian had prepared me well for the research and educational aspects of the work, but my personal experience with financial exploitation gave me credibility that no textbook could provide. The work was emotionally challenging, but deeply rewarding. I met seniors who had been victimized by their own children, grandchildren, and caregivers. I also met family members who were genuinely struggling to help elderly relatives navigate complex decisions without crossing the line into inappropriate control. Most importantly, I met other seniors like myself who had found the courage to fight back against exploitation. Each story reinforced my belief that aging didn't require surrendering independence or accepting mistreatment from people who claimed to love us. My house on Maple Street had been transformed as well. The spare bedroom that had once served as storage became an office where I prepared training materials and consulted with other elder abuse victims. The basement where Frank had pursued his woodworking hobby became a meeting space for a support group I'd started for seniors who had experienced financial exploitation by family members. Helen next door had become one of my strongest allies in this new mission. Her guilt over being manipulated by Brian's lies had motivated her to become an advocate for elder rights in our community. She now served as a volunteer with our local area agency on aging, helping seniors understand their rights and connect with protective resources. George had responded to the situation by becoming hypervigilant about protecting elderly neighbors from potential scams or exploitation. He'd organized a neighborhood watch program specifically focused on senior safety, and he regularly checked on elderly residents who lived alone. But the relationship that had grown most meaningful was with my grandson Alex. Now 18 and preparing for college, he had chosen to write his senior thesis on elder abuse prevention. His research had included interviewing other teenagers whose grandparents had been victimized by family members, and his insights into the psychological impact on younger family members had been both heartbreaking and illuminating. "Grandma, I need to ask you something," Alex had said during one of our weekly dinners together. Do you ever regret reporting Dad to the police? Do you wish you'd tried to handle it privately as a family matter? I had considered the question carefully before responding. Alex, protecting yourself from abuse isn't something you should have to handle privately. When someone commits crimes against you, reporting those crimes isn't vindictive. It's appropriate. Your father's behavior wasn't a family matter. It was criminal behavior that happened to occur within a family. I think about that sometimes when my friends complain about their parents. The difference between normal family conflict and actual abuse. Dad crossed a line that most people would never even consider crossing. Alex's ability to understand and articulate the distinction between normal family dynamics and criminal exploitation had given me hope for his future relationships and his ability to protect himself and others from manipulation. Emma, now 16, had chosen a different path for processing her father's actions. She rarely discussed the situation directly, but she had thrown herself into volunteer work with a local domestic violence shelter. Her counselor believed that helping other abuse victims was her way of making sense of the betrayal she'd experienced within her own family. Stephanie had filed for divorce within 3 months of Brian's conviction. Her attorney had contacted me through Carol to discuss whether I would be willing to provide a character reference for her during custody proceedings. After considerable thought, I had agreed, but only because I believed maintaining relationships with my grandchildren was more important than punishing Stephanie for her complicity in Brian's scheme. The divorce had been finalized quickly, with Stephanie receiving primary custody of the children and Brian paying substantial child support from his income at the warehouse job he'd taken after his landscaping business collapsed. The financial pressure that had motivated his crimes against me hadn't disappeared, but he was now addressing it through honest work rather than exploitation. I had maintained no contact with Brian since the courthouse, and I had no desire to rebuild a relationship with someone who had proven capable of such calculated betrayal. Some people believed that family bonds should transcend any behavior, but I had learned that love without respect was meaningless, and trust without honesty was impossible. Margaret from the library had remained one of my closest friends and strongest supporters throughout the ordeal. She had helped me research legal precedents for elder abuse cases and had connected me with advocacy organizations that could amplify the impact of my experience. Kath, do you ever think about what your life would look like now if you hadn't overheard that phone call? Margaret had asked during a recent coffee date. I probably would have ended up exactly where Brian wanted me, declared incompetent and warehoused in some facility while he liquidated my assets. The frightening thing is how close he came to succeeding. If I'd been even slightly less sharp, or if I'd trusted his version of my capabilities over my own perceptions, he might have gotten away with it completely. The advocacy work had introduced me to seniors who hadn't been as fortunate as I'd been. People who had signed over financial power of attorney to children who immediately drained their accounts. Elderly individuals who had been convinced by family members that they were incompetent when they were actually just isolated or depressed. Grandparents who had lost their homes to adult children who claimed to be nice-minded, helping with financial management. Each story reinforced my gratitude for my own outcome and my determination to help others protect themselves from similar exploitation. The work also reminded me that aging didn't have to mean becoming vulnerable. Knowledge, planning, and strong support networks could preserve independence and dignity well into advanced age. On a crisp October morning, exactly 1 year after I'd overheard Brian's funeral planning call, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee and the morning newspaper. The local paper featured a story about our elder abuse prevention program, including a photo of me speaking at a community center about recognizing financial exploitation. Looking at that photo, I barely recognized the woman I'd been a year earlier. The grieving widow who had been hiding from life had been replaced by an advocate who was actively engaged in protecting others from the kind of betrayal I'd experienced. The transformation hadn't been planned or sought, but it had given my retirement a purpose I'd never expected. My phone rang, interrupting my reflection. It was Carol, calling with news about a case she was handling for another elder abuse victim. Kath, I have a client who's going through something very similar to what you experienced. Her daughter has been telling people she has dementia and is trying to gain control of her finances. Would you be willing to speak with her? Sometimes hearing from someone who's been through it successfully can make all the difference. I agreed immediately. Over the past year, I'd spoken with dozens of seniors who were facing or had survived family financial exploitation. Each conversation reinforced my belief that sharing our stories was one of the most powerful tools we had for protecting ourselves and each other. As I prepared to leave for that afternoon's consultation, I stopped by Frank's photograph on my desk. For months after his death, I'd felt like half of myself was missing. The grief had been so overwhelming that I'd wanted to disappear rather than face a world without him. But Brian's betrayal had inadvertently taught me something important about survival and strength. The woman Frank had loved and married was still there, underneath the grief and fear. She had just needed a reason to fight for herself again. "Frank, I think you'd be proud of what I've become," I said to his photo. "I'm not the same woman you left behind, but I'm someone you would recognize and respect." That evening, after a successful consultation with Carol's client, I sat in my garden among the roses that had survived another winter. Spring was coming again, bringing new growth and new possibilities. I was 79 years old, healthy, financially secure, and engaged in work that mattered. Brian had intended to plan my funeral, but instead he'd helped me plan a new life. I couldn't have asked for a better revenge than the simple act of thriving, despite his worst intentions. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.